As someone who has previously worked for the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, I'm aware of the many challenges faced by survivors of domestic violence and the need for comprehensive safety and service planning that includes both animals and access to safe and stable housing. When there is violence in the home, all in that home, human and animal, are at risk. The number of DV shelters and programs that welcome survivors and their pets has grown in the last decade, but that shelter is temporary and often time limited. In New York City, this often means survivors are forced to transition to shelters for homeless individuals and families. This is part of the reason that domestic violence is the leading cause of family homelessness in New York City, with around 40% of those in family shelters citing domestic violence as the primary cause of their homelessness. Just as much as the issues of domestic violence and animal abuse have been linked, it is impossible to disentangle domestic violence and homelessness. This session will explore these connections and highlight the need for comprehensive services and safety planning for survivors of domestic violence, who very often are also people experiencing homelessness. We are fortunate to have 3 speakers with us here today who have vast experience working at these intersections and invaluable perspective to offer. And I'm sure that their presentations will generate an interesting conversation. So without further ado, we will start with our first presenter. First up, we have Dr. Maya Gupta. Dr. Maya Gupta is currently Senior Director of Research for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, overseeing the development and dissemination of cutting-edge applied research on veterinary forensics, animal behavior, law enforcement response to animal cruelty, community engagement, equine welfare, farm animals, excuse me one moment. Farm animals, disaster response, and issues. She previously served as Executive Director of the Georgia-based Ahimsa House, a statewide animal safe house program for victims of domestic violence, and subsequently as Executive Director of the Animals and Society Institute. Welcome, Maya. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And are you all able to see my slides? Just a quick tech check. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kevin, and thank you to everybody for allowing me to be here to chat just a bit about not only the link, which I dare say is a term many, if not most of us, have heard at some point in our work, but really going beyond this to expand our ideas of the link, thinking about risks beyond immediate safety and services beyond immediate shelter. Now, to begin with, I think it's important to understand why we're talking about domestic violence within the context of a conference on homelessness and housing. Although I believe our other presenters and the compelling story we just saw have done a fine job of helping us understand the intersections between the domestic violence system and homeless service system, and the intersections between the safety and well-being of humans and animals across those contexts. But what we'll cover today is just a brief 101 on the dynamics of the link between domestic violence and animals and cruelty. First of all, I want to note that I've put animals/cruelty there because one of the things I want to talk about today is that not only is animal cruelty connected to domestic violence, the issue of animals and their roles in our lives is intimately connected to domestic violence. And both of those issues are important when we think about safety and well-being, including housing for both human and animal survivors of violence. The goat is also important, and I'll come back to him in a moment. Why are housing and homelessness core issues in this work? In other words, how do the dynamics of the link involve and intersect with what we're talking about here today? And finally, where do we still need to broaden our scope of services and perhaps even our thinking and our perspective in terms of who is a survivor, who is at risk, and how can we help? Some of you will have seen this graphic before. I apologize, it's hard to get it to a sufficient size to see on a Zoom screen, let alone in a real conference room. So maybe we'll be glad we're on Zoom for today. This is known as the Power and Control Wheel, developed by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, has been in use in the domestic violence advocacy field for a number of years, despite some competing models. But basically, it gives us the idea of a scope of power and control dynamics that exist within the context of domestically violent relationships. And you'll see here, although it's hard to see the subtext in each wedge of the wheel, that we're talking about a number of different types of violence, and we're talking about a number of different types of dynamics that are implicated in the violence, everything from economic abuse, coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using privilege, and using children. Now, one of the things you probably can't see very clearly due to the small font is that abusing pets is featured under the using intimidation segment of this wheel. But by the time we're done speaking today, I hope that you will agree with me that using pets and other animals in the context of domestic violence actually can fit in most, if not all, of these wedges of the power and control wheel. So we'll come back to this. Let me tell you a little bit more about what this looks like and how animal cruelty actually forms a tactic in the context of domestic violence. So the number one thing we experience is threats to harm or get rid of the animal. And this can be used as a very effective coercion tool, especially to silence a victim from either attempting to escape the abuse or attempting to tell anybody about the abuse. It's also simply a way to retaliate against some perceived wrong that a human victim has committed. The idea that I can take something away from you is a key concept in power and control. And while service animals are not the only way in which we see this manifestation, it certainly is one aspect we hear about when victims do have service and support animals, that if the abuser can harm, kill, or give away the service or support animal, then that abuser has managed to further incapacitate something that that victim relies upon for safety, security, and well-being. Jealousy of the human victim's bond with the animal is also really common. So the idea that she can't love anything as much as or more than she loves me. And this is one of the dynamics that oftentimes precipitates the animal being targeted. I want to note that often victims, human victims that is, are forced to watch or even participate in the abuse of the animal in the context of the domestic violence. And we can imagine the emotional trauma that that can take. Financial control, now we'll go back to that sector of the wheel we just saw, is as important as the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse that we're talking about here. Very commonly have seen in my work that the abuser not only does other things to the animal, but also doesn't allow the human victim to take the animal to, for example, the veterinarian once the animal has been injured, or simply doesn't allow flea preventive to be purchased, heartworm preventive, sometimes even pet food to be purchased for the animal. So the idea of withholding care and acts of omission is also important here, even though for many of us, we may have a thought bubble that brings up images of kicking and hitting and sort of the more commonly envisaged forms of abuse. Finally, although we are talking a lot about violence from one partner to another, it's important to recognize that domestic violence and family violence truly occur across the lifespan, and that children are often involved in the mix of family violence, as well as when animals are involved. So, for example, an abuser can exploit the child's bond with the animal by saying things like, well, it's your mom's fault we had to get rid of the dog. So using the harm to the animal as a way to drive a wedge between the child and the other parent, or simply using the harm to the animal as a way to emotionally abuse the child instead of or in addition to the adult. It's also so important to note elder abuse as a feature of the dynamics of family violence and the dynamics of the link. We commonly see situations where adult protective services caseworkers are observing some of these same types of dynamics where perhaps an adult child of an older adult has taken on some caregiving responsibilities and is threatening or actually harming an animal as a way to control or coerce that older adult. Lastly, I'll just note that the idea of I can still get to you, whether that's I can still get to you to obtain control of your animal through the justice system, or I can still get to you to take something away from you. I can still get to you and get a hold of your animal, and it means you had better come back home. Or simply, I can hurt your animal so that I can hurt you, is a core message in domestic violence, part of the messages and dynamics of power and control. And one reason that domestic violence very often goes beyond the initial search for safety, the initial search for shelter, and really becomes an issue for survivors across their lifetimes. So with that somewhat dismal background, I do want to talk about some further barriers to escape. I mentioned that the threats of and harm to the animals are very often a control tactic to prevent human victims from seeking escape. In fact, the organization that Kevin mentioned, Ahimsa House in Georgia, was founded by a survivor of domestic violence who was told by her abuser that if she attempted to leave, she would never see her cats again. Unfortunately, she couldn't find a shelter to take her cats to with her, was forced to place them with someone she didn't know very well and didn't feel very comfortable with, but didn't have an option, and unfortunately never saw them again. So in addition to the barriers that prevent seeking safety because of concern about the animals, we often do find, as has already been mentioned, that animals are often still not welcome in shelters for domestic violence, although in a moment I'll talk about some of the great progress we've seen in the field, but also, and very much so, as we're talking about in this entire conference, in the homelessness sheltering system. And since, again, we know that domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness in the US, especially for women and children, this is a place where we have to pay attention because survivors of domestic violence are entering the homeless service system as they are entering the domestic violence service system. But even if they don't, animals might not be welcome if you can go to your family's house, if you can go to your friend's house. The reason I say if is because in many cases, abusers have succeeded in isolating human victims of abuse from their family and friends, and they may not have any support network to go to. However, it's important to recognize that there are barriers to animals in housing that go above and beyond emergency shelters, including rental housing and long-term housing. Further, beyond housing, beyond simply having a place to go, the logistics of getting out can be quite difficult. And this becomes even more complicated when you're talking about having multiple animals, large animals, unusual species, or seeking safety across long distances. Some survivors need to escape across state lines because stalking is so common. And you may be able to take your suitcase on the Greyhound bus lines, but what happens when you can't take your Greyhound on Greyhound? So there are a lot of additional considerations here. And although our conference is focusing on housing, I do want to note them in thinking about the broader scope of needs we have to address when thinking about the intersections of these issues. And finally, coming back again to financial barriers, in addition to simply getting out and finding a place to stay, what about the costs of immediate veterinary care, longer-term veterinary care, food and supplies, and things like pet deposits and pet rent in housing? These can really add up, especially for survivors who, in many cases, are escaping with nothing more than their animals and the clothes they have with them. So let's talk a bit about how all these dynamics can and do translate into the behavior of human victims. And you'll note I always parenthesize human victims as a reminder that we have both human and animal victims of abuse. As we've mentioned, escaping abuse is already incredibly difficult, but we know from research that a sizable percentage of human victims of violence delay seeking safety from domestic violence due to concern for their animals. And the trouble with this research is that It's compelling already, but that's only interviewing those who actually did get out and then told us about it. We don't know how many others never leave. And we do know of some who reach safety, but then return to protect their animals, either because they weren't able to figure out a way of getting their animals out with them, or because they had nowhere safe for their animals to stay with them. And further, we know that there are victims who, in addition to delaying seeking safety or not seeking safety at all, they delay calling the police for this reason, or they refuse to testify against their abusers, or they recant their testimony, all because, in addition to other reasons for their concerns about their own safety and that of any children they may have, they're concerned about the safety of their animals as well. So let's talk a little bit about the progress we've made as a field, and I'm using the collective we here. This has been a huge effort across the last 20 plus years, and I'm pleased to report that we have actually seen some remarkable progress. I should have actually put this second sort of darker green box first here, because I think the increased awareness that we've seen of this topic drives all the other progress, and we really have seen increased awareness. The topic of domestic violence in animals has been covered in People magazine and major news outlets. But in addition to the media, we've seen policymakers sit up and take notice. We've seen professionals in both animal welfare and human services increasingly take notice. And we've seen quite a bit of attention from researchers to this topic as well, although there's always room for more. And so the first thing I can point to, and others in this session and at this conference can tell you more about it, but there's been quite a bit of growth in the number of domestic violence shelters, emergency shelters at least, that do accommodate pets, either on site, which can be a model of having a separate kenneling facility somewhere at the shelter, or a co-housing type model where animals are staying in residence rooms, or off-site, which often happens through partnerships with humane societies, veterinary offices, doggy daycares or boarding kennels, or networks of volunteer foster homes, or some combination of those. I mentioned the policymakers have sat up and taken notice, and again, certainly more work to be done here. But the best example I can point to is the growth of provisions that explicitly authorize the inclusion of animals in domestic violence protective orders. And this is important for a number of reasons, including but not limited to the fact that in most cases, domestic violence protective orders can authorize exclusive use of a residence, by the petitioner, in other words, by the victim. And so when we're talking about housing, now especially when we're talking about some species that may be difficult to find alternate housing for, it can be very important for a survivor of violence to have access to the residence. That's not the only provision that, these type of orders can offer. However, we've seen these happen in a number of states. Further, we've seen, although at a much slower pace, a recognition of expanding the statutory definitions of domestic violence to include animal cruelty or even threats to animals that are perpetrated in the context of that family violence or with intent to harm a person. And in some cases, increased penalties for animal cruelty committed, for example, in the presence of a child. And I'm going to wait and let Debbie tell you a little bit more about some of the very interesting funding streams that have come about as a consequence of this growth in awareness and changes in policy. But I'll just note that at the federal and state levels, as well as from nonprofit and private funding sources, we've seen a real increase in funding for example, domestic violence shelters to build pet kennels or other facilities on site, or to retrofit existing housing to allow animals, or in some cases, like Urban Resource Institute, to build fantastic new facilities altogether. Some funding to provide veterinary care, so one of the additional needs I mentioned, to cover pet deposits or pet rent, or even emergency boarding for animals. For program staffing, I was proud to be at the helm of the first program, I believe, to receive VOCA, Victims of Crime Act funding, simply to provide staffing support for our 24-hour crisis line to assist human and animal victims of domestic violence in reaching safety. And finally, programs that assist in providing ongoing training and technical assistance on the topic of animals and domestic violence. But we can't rest on our laurels and celebrate these accomplishments just yet. Let me tell you just a little bit about where we've more work to do, and then I'll turn it over to our other speakers to tell you a bit more. So the number one area where I see an opportunity for growth is in addressing species beyond pets. So you remember the goat we had on our first slide. Let's come back to him and let's come back to this horse. We have understandably focused on housing for dogs, for cats, for other species that are easy to house. But the logistics and the challenges that accompany having other species can be significant. And in many cases, programs don't have the types of facilities on site, certainly, or the types of community partnerships that are necessary to ensure that we can accommodate all of the animals that may be in a victim's lives. I would challenge us even to expand our rhetoric so that when we catch ourselves saying domestic violence and pets, we reframe that to domestic violence and animals. We know that it isn't simply dogs and cats, it's any animal in a victim's life that person cares about that can be targeted by an abuser. I'd also challenge us to think about needs beyond immediate safety. And this comes from a trauma-informed, survivor-centered approach to domestic violence and other human services. So safety is important, and we do need to find an immediate place for somebody to escape. However, well-being is also important. And I would extend that to not only the safety and well-being of the human victim, but also the animal victim and attending to those animals' emotional needs as well. We would be doing a great disservice if we thought of this type of service as only providing a way for humans to be able to have their animals with them instead of a way for humans and animals to reach safety together. Then we really need to think some more about victims who don't go to shelters, either domestic violence shelters or homeless shelters. And we know that there's a sizable percentage of victims of domestic violence who don't enter the sheltering system. As I mentioned, they may be trying to find alternative forms of housing, and they can face incredible barriers to doing so, including barriers bringing their animals with them. We know of a number of individuals who have become homeless or lived in their cars with their animals as a result of this. Now, technically, someone should be able to call a domestic violence service program and receive outpatient services, safety planning, legal advocacy, et cetera, even if they're not entering domestic violence shelters. However, we know that the bulk of the attention on the animal connection has been focused on the emergency housing at the shelter, and I challenge us to go beyond that. Housing needs beyond emergency housing. I believe this is also something that Debbie will tell you more about, as she's a housing expert with NNEDB. However, really thinking about transitional housing and even longer term and permanent housing is huge for domestic violence survivors, full stop. But then when we add in the animal equation, so what good is it if we have programs that allow somebody to find immediate safety with their animal, and then they find that there are no transitional housing options that will allow them to bring their animals with them? I've been in those situations with clients I've served, and it really felt like we were letting those clients and their animals down. Then I'd say that we need to think about the scope of needs beyond housing altogether. And again, this is a housing focused conference, but I want to note them because I think they're important in thinking about providing a wraparound approach to care. So these including animals in the safety planning, in getting them safely to safety. So transportation needs, what happens if public transport won't take your animal? Legal advocacy, so assisting survivors and including their animals in petitions for domestic violence protective orders as one example, or assisting survivors in navigating challenges from their abusers through the legal system to attempt to gain custody and control of those animals back. And finally, I'm very excited that we have a speaker from the Family Justice Center of New York in our session today, who will tell you more about some massive strides in the justice system response to co-occurring cases of animal cruelty and domestic violence. But I would say that broadly, as an entire justice system, there needs to be greater awareness of these intersecting cases and a way to handle them more holistically. Finally, and again, coming from a survivor-centered, trauma-informed approach to our work, I would call for more flexible service models that, as you see here, that recognize the individual needs of both human and animal survivors and that empower self-determination. And what I mean by this goes well beyond the scope of what we have time to talk about today. But I would encourage us to begin thinking about more than a one-size-fits-all approach to our service delivery. We've come a long way. We have a lot more options for survivors and their animals than we did when I first entered this field. And now we may need to think about the fact that there may be no one program model that works best for every single individual and every single animal. And I invite us in the next decade of our work in this area and in our partnership with others doing work in housing and other forms of homelessness to embrace this issue together and explore the nuance within it. And with that, I'll close and hand it over to our next speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Maya. That was extremely informative. And we thank you so much for your incredible knowledge and experience and the advocacy that has been so instrumental in advancing the availability of co-sheltering and all the other services for victims and survivors with pets. So thank you for all that you've done to advance these issues, and we look forward to engaging with you further during our Q&A later. All right, up next, we have Debbie Fox. Debbie is the Deputy Director, Housing Policy and Practice at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. In this role, Debbie leads national domestic violence-related housing policy and provides technical assistance and training to NNEDV's coalition membership and their partners as a part of the Domestic Violence Housing and Technical Assistance Consortium. Through NNEDV's policy work, Debbie was instrumental in working with Congress to fund HUD's DVSA $50 million continuum on care bonus funds. Debbie has over 25 years in the DV and housing field with a focus on fundraising, organizational development, nonprofit administration, and domestic violence population-specific housing and economic justice programming. Prior to joining NNEDV, she worked as a DV housing funder in county government and shared community leadership in the systems planning and implementation process for the DV system in Portland, Oregon. Thank you so much for joining us, Debbie. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for the introduction. And thank you, Maya, for really prepping my presentation and giving a little bit of a glimpse into kind of where we are in the field as it relates to the intersection and of DV housing and expanding how we're doing our work. And I'm just really honored and excited to be here because the intersection and the intersectionality around working on issues around housing and homelessness, and then also the connectedness around oppression of animals, and those links has been a big part of my work and my personal, just personal passion. On the side, I also volunteer and am during the pandemic, I've been doing fostering with pets and animals, and I have a foster fail underneath me right now under my desk. My dog's here, Benny, and so I work a lot closely with our Humane Society here in the District of Columbia, and then I do dog daycare and training on the side as well. So yeah, so it's been a big passion of mine, just the intersection of feminist theory and critical theory around oppression of animals and oppression of other people in our society, and just seeing all those links. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of the work that I'm doing. I know Kevin mentioned that I do a lot of TA and training on the issue of housing and DV and SA. I definitely do not do that alone. I'm a part of a consortium called the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. And so that consortium has been around for about 6 years now. There was a real recognition a number of years ago for some federal agencies and federal partners at the federal government that really saw that there was some access issues that survivors were having in terms of accessing housing and shelter and longer term supports through the homelessness housing system and public housing system. So we wanted to ensure that if survivors are coming to the victim services program or coming into the homelessness services program in our community, that they were really being screened into services, and there was an understanding of some of the dynamics that were happening in their life, and they might not always be sharing or fully disclosing all the things that might be impacting them as it relates to the abuse and the dynamics of their abuse that are happening and the isolation in their lives. And so if we could go to the next slide, please. So the federal partners who fund the work around the TA training that we're doing, it's a number of agencies that fund domestic violence programs in our country, but also housing and homelessness programs. So we get funding from HUD and the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services to do this work. And then I do this work in partnership with other technical assistance providers that have been really helpful in terms of expanding our work and really elevating this issue and being more responsive to survivors and their pets in our communities across the country. So I work closely with Collaborative Solutions, which is a HUD TA provider, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, my organization, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So just a little bit more about NAV on the next slide, please, is we are a social change organization, and we have been committed to doing work since about 1994. We've been around since the inception of the first passage of the Violence Against Women Act. That was in 1994. We're currently in the process of hopefully trying to pass it. The Senate introduced the Violence Against Women Act last month, so we're trying to pass it. This month it's been 6 years of work trying to pass that legislation, and that's the funding stream that funds a majority of the domestic violence and sexual violence services in our country. So we're working on passing that legislation. That's why we were created as an organization. And then we have many projects as a part of our work, but in particular, I focus on housing for survivors and do technical assistance and training on those issues. And then we have a membership of state coalitions. On the next slide, please. And those state domestic violence coalitions are part of the states and territories. And we also work with tribal coalitions as well. We provide support to that membership, and then each state coalition and territory works with the domestic and sexual violence programs and stakeholders in their community. So as we're thinking about expanding our work, being more inclusive of survivors who are seeking services with their pets, we want to be working with our state coalitions and seeing what networks they have. Often they are leading the way and doing technical assistance and training for their membership in their state. And and more states are probably thinking about this intersectionality than others. So there's also a piece of just like bringing people along and educating state coalitions too of how we can build these partnerships and ensure that we're looking at the entirety of survivors' lives and their families as they're seeking shelter, and how we can be responsive to them as they are coming to seek services. So a little bit of an overview of what we'll be covering today is just thinking a little bit more about how we can expand our shelter and housing programs to be inclusive of pets, and how those programmatic adaptations are happening, and then that focus on flexible funding, and then all the new federal housing. And there are federal investments and policy investments that are looking at this intersection, and we have legislators who are very passionate about this issue as well. So we have friends and allies on the Hill that are also moving this along at the federal level. So when we think about services and shelter, slide 6, please. I know Maya mentioned earlier the importance of trauma-informed care and implementing trauma-informed care, but we really want to be thinking about those pieces around what does that mean, and what does that mean to be expansive around providing shelter, to be inclusive of pets. So we want to think about all the different things when a survivor is reaching out to us, and making sure that we're letting them know of all the various options. So I think it was mentioned earlier, like survivors don't always want to reach out or are afraid to reach out because of either information or myths that they have been told, or from the isolation, or what they've been told from the abuser. But it's really important to think about on the front end when you're expanding shelter and housing services, to think about what your assessments look like, what your information looks like. And instead of kind of old models, what we used to do, kind of like people would assume they were just coming to shelter, like really letting people know that there are things have changed and that there's a different focus on housing first and being more flexible. And now we have a lot more options and there's a lot more funding and funding streams, still not always enough to meet the need, but there are more options in terms of flexible funding. So if a survivor wanted to stay in their home, if we could find ways for them to stay safely in their home and like help them with different expenses around being there, and then thinking about different partnerships around flexible funding to like help folks take care of their pets and the animals, family members in their lives. And then we also think about like just letting survivors know that there are different options, that there are more funding streams around housing first, rental assistance. If someone needs new housing, they can potentially get some support around relocating. So we just want to really be thinking about those things on the front end and letting survivors know in a trauma-informed way that they have access to more resources than they might have thought possible, and maybe have an old model of just coming to shelter and how animals were not always welcomed in the kind of the old model of how we thought of sheltering. And then we've made some real different shifts during the pandemic because we have had to socially distance and really create environments where folks have more privacy, which has actually been a positive thing for survivors and their healing. And that often has provided the opportunity for programs to shelter survivors in what we would consider like more non-traditional shelter models, where it might be a hotel or a motel or renting a house that could be used as a shelter, different options that look a little different than the old traditional model of like communal shelter. So the next slide, please. So we want to be thinking about how we implement voluntary services and trauma-informed care. So we really are thinking the model for our field is that we're doing voluntary services with culturally inclusive services centering language justice, and that we provide services that focus on healing and health. And we know that there's a various modalities and options, and that including all family configurations and including pets is a very critical part of the healing process and making sure our services are trauma informed. So we want to really be thinking about the awareness of the trauma and the effects of survivors on their family. And of course, we know that the trauma and animals are also impacted by abuse, and how we create that awareness and that safety for survivors. On a somatic, physical, emotional level, there's a real recentering that needs to happen as people heal from abuse. Same for animals, as those of us who foster animals and see those that have experienced abuse or trauma, like there's a time of safety and rebuilding and trustworthiness in that process, in that relationship. And we really want to empower decision making for survivors and make those decisions in partnership with survivors. And so obviously that includes the whole totality of what a survivor is bringing into the program or services, and making those decisions together. And then we're also wanting to ensure that we're inclusive for all, and we are thinking about centering disability justice and those from marginalized group and those who have been historically discriminated against in housing. So we want to be thinking about all of those things when we're implementing trauma-informed care. And I really think if we're thinking of those models, the trauma-informed care model, we're really building a model that is inclusive of all different family types and inclusive of survivors with pets. Next slide, please. And so really what has shifted, especially in the last few years, in the last couple of years with the pandemic, we have seen a rapid shift in our field where we have seen programs move mountains to make housing choices more expansive and to really shift their programmatic services. And now we see a lot more privacy and more options, and the shift, as I mentioned before, around housing first and expanding shelter with more private spaces. And then a part of that work is really trying to figure out how to have holistic healing spaces and how to break down isolation of abuse and trauma. And then I'm thinking in particular, there's a project out of Washington State a number of years ago, but they really kind of led the way in our field. I don't know, it's been 7 or 8 years ago, just how we can design programs, shelters, and really center the dignity of meeting survivors' needs and their self-determination, and thinking about their security and having those connections and what is possible, like really designing our spaces and places where people come to, and housing, and even our social housing and affordable housing in our country. Like, how can we design it to be really really inclusive, dignified spaces that really are built for families and our pets and our worlds to survive. So, we don't often meet those goals, but it's really good to kind of have that North Star of like what we're aiming for, to have really, really places that are really meeting the needs of where survivors are at. And so we have shifted to safe housing over the last number of years, really broadening our definition of shelter. Next slide, please. And we used to think of housing in the DV movement as more transitional housing, temporary solutions, to now really being part and more integrated in our communities around having more HUD funding, more long-term housing, more affordable housing, and having eviction and prevention and homelessness funding. So when a survivor calls, our ideal is that they know those options, and there's various options. Next slide, please. It's hard to cover all this in 20 minutes. So thinking about safe housing for survivors and their pets, we really want to be thinking about having lots of different pots of money, flexible programming, financial assistance, really broad eligibility requirements, minimal program requirements coming from that voluntary services lens, minimal rules, really understanding that survivors have been through a lot and have lost a lot of autonomy in the isolation of their relationship. And so really bringing folks in a way that's centering safety, autonomy, equity at the center, and survivor-driven, culturally responsive, linguistically responsive services. And we really want to be flexible for survivors, thinking about survivors who might have various health needs, or who are looking to like rebuild their credit that might have been destroyed during their abuse, or thinking about survivors who might be working on their U visa and immigration issues. So just really having flexible duration for survivors who need longer term support, and who are able to kind of rebuild some of those broken bonds as they reconnect with their community, and really setting up survivors to have long-term success in seeking safety and support in our services. And then we have a little handy dandy chart here. I've talked about this a lot, but this next slide, please, just talks about the need for different types of housing, because some survivors might need, temporary housing, and that safety and confidentiality if they're in a lot of danger from the person who's causing them harm. Shelter plays an important role in that. But then there might be survivors who could stay in their home, or they might need transitional housing, or they might be able to move from their home directly into, a rapid rehousing HUD program, a homeless program. So we really want to try to create models where people have options, and they know that they have options, and that we're being inclusive of survivors and all the members of their family that they want to be housing and moving into a different situation with. And then lastly, I have a couple more slides to just talk about our housing increases. I won't go into a lot of detail on this because it's a lot of numbers and a lot of dollars, but there are a lot more resources within the HUD world, and in the homelessness world, also in the DV world with our family violence prevention services funding. So there's a lot of funding and different funding streams that people can have access to. And I even forgot to include on this, there's Treasury rental assistance money, 25 billion, that's still being rolled out as a result of the pandemic. So there's a lot of increases in support during this time. that you can be looking at to try to get access to for survivors. And then there's a particular bill, next slide, please, that talks about, there's an act called the Pause Act that came out, that was introduced a couple of years ago and passed. So this is not a ton of money, but it is an authorized set aside for $3 million for agencies can apply to get emergency and transitional housing assistance. So there's support for agencies that want to expand their services to be more inclusive of pets and survivors fleeing with their pets. So it is a competitive grant program at the Office of Victims of Crime at the Department of Justice. So it is, it's not a ton of money, but it is important and symbolic. And I think it will be expanded probably over the years that there is a federal funding stream, and the importance about this funding is so critical that folks and folks in Congress are recognizing this as an issue for survivors. So I want to make sure, I know I'm getting short on time, but just thinking about, there's just a lot of communities doing a lot of really great work, really expanding how they're doing services. And then, last couple slides are just like thinking about what could be your next steps, how you could partner with your DV coalitions, housing agencies, applying for the Pause Act funding, different things like that to be more expansive as you think about shelter and housing. And then also we at the DV Housing TA Consortium are always open to hearing great models that work on the ground, so we can share with other organizations so they know what's possible, as people are always kind of like, how can we do this? Or how can we have pets in our shelter? Or like all those things. So if you are doing some of the work or have examples, we always love to share examples and make those connections so people can see what's possible. And then the last slide, if you can go to the Safe Housing Partnership slide, that would be great. People can contact us here at the Safe Housing Partnerships website for more information or TA and ways that we can work together. And I see there's probably a lot of experts on this intersection, and there's so much more we can learn as a consortium. And it's, I feel like it's still kind of new as shelters are expanding their services and being more inclusive of pets, but I think there's more work to be done, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. And, access to housing for survivors of domestic violence is crucially important. And NEDV's role nationally in advocating has been so significant. So thank you for sharing more of your work, and we look forward to speaking with you during our Q&A. So last but certainly not least, we have Denise Corsic and gender-based violence. At the Queens Family Justice Center, she works closely with various not-for-profit organizations, city agencies, and community stakeholders to provide free and confidential support services to survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, elder abuse, and other forms of gender-based violence, including human trafficking, stalking, family violence, and sexual assault. Thank you so much for joining us, Denise, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you so much to everyone who spoke prior. I'm really excited and honored to be part of this amazing panel to speak about this really important subject. So thank you again. I am Denise. I am out of the mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence, and my outpost is actually at the Queens Family Justice Center. There is a family justice center located in each of the 5 New York City boroughs. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the services that we do provide to survivors of intimate partner and gender-based violence, and also our partnership with Urban Resource Institute to help those survivors seeking shelter and seeking to flee domestic violence with their pets. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about domestic violence, the larger umbrella of domestic violence. Before 2018, my office was known as the Office to Combat Domestic Violence, and that really targeted intimate partner violence, which can occur between romantic partners, people who have previously dated or are currently dating on and off, married, separated, LGBTQIA+ identifying partners, folks with children in common. So that general, like very traditional definition of what we've called domestic violence in the past. However, in 2018, we've expanded to include other types of violence, in particular gender-based violence and family violence that can occur between people related by blood or marriage, or gender-based violence that can include sexual assault violence or sex trafficking violence, those areas where a person is particularly targeted because of their gender, maybe stemming from gender norms or role expectations that may cause a cycle of violence to continue. Next slide, please. So some of the resources that the Family Justice Center provides for survivors of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Next slide, please. The Family Justice Center in particular, where I'm out of. So the Family Justice Center, the goal of the FJC, if you will, is to connect survivors of domestic and gender-based violence and their children to services provided by a multitude of different professionals across disciplines in order to provide a holistic approach to services and connections that survivors of domestic violence may need. In particular, what's great about the Family Justice Center is that the professionals across disciplines are actually all on site here, and it's essentially, the goal is to have a one-stop shop for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. It makes it a lot easier to walk in and be able to, let's say, to speak to an immigration or family law attorney, then do some safety planning with a case manager, possibly report an incident to the NYPD or other law enforcement agencies, and to have survivors come to one place where that is all possible. Now, the Family Justice Center, prior to the pandemic, we were a full walk-in center, no appointment needed, providing this safe and confidential services to clients. As you might imagine, at the height of the pandemic in March of 2020, our buildings did physically close. And then we completely pivoted to a walk-in model to a remote services service model. There were a lot of different challenges, I'm sure, as you might imagine, especially with survivors at this time not having a lot of ability or any ability in most matters to actually leave an abusive or potentially abusive environment. And so we've slowly reopened our facilities. We are seeing clients again. You can come in without an appointment, or you can continue to engage with us through our remote services. Our services are free, they're confidential, they're completely voluntary, and are accessible regardless of a person's immigration status, their income, the language spoken, gender identity, age, disability, income, or any other previous involvements with the systems, particularly criminal justice systems. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we closed, that's fine. We closed in March of 2020, but we have slowly reopened. And this is just some information about our hybrid service model that exists now. A survivor can come either in or connect with us over the phone. Next slide, please. I wanted just to provide everyone our contact information for the 5 family justice centers so that the clients survivors who may be interested in our services can easily connect with us. Next slide, please. So some of the services that we offer through the Family Justice Center is risk assessment and safety planning. The safety planning component is particularly important, and one of the first things that clients engage in with a case manager. This is what we've seen and what we've experienced is that clients or survivors seeking to flee domestic violence may have pets or animals that they're concerned about, but it may not be the first and forefront in their mind when they come to try to work with a case manager to safety plan, to figure out a way, as we've seen in the video, to figure out a way how to first get out safely. Safety planning can begin by just talking to someone about what do I need to gather in case I have to go? The essentials, documents, clothing, medication. Where can I go if I need to leave a particular situation? How can I go with my children? So safety planning, we'll see oftentimes starts with, especially with families that involve children. The main question, or one of the bigger questions, may be, if I take my child, what are the ramifications that can come out of that? And so sometimes, the safety planning involves maybe first talking to an attorney, a family law attorney that we also have here on site at the Family Justice Center, to figure out, can I even do this? And what happens if I do this? And oftentimes you can imagine that when the areas of a safety plan are concerned, the pet component or the animal component may fall a little bit below first and foremost, but it is still crucially important. And it does come out later on, once a client, for instance, is able to assess their risk, figure out where they're going to go. It may come up then, okay, well, how can I then take my pet with me? And this is where it's so crucial, our partnership with Urban Resource Institute, so crucial to have this partnership with URI that allows a case manager to really cohesively, in-depth safety plan with a client that can include a conversation about taking a beloved pet. So again, we have mentioned about the case management piece of the services that are offered in the Family Justice Center. And when a client does walk in, they can expect to be linked with a case manager first and foremost in order to do that risk assessment, that safety planning, and then figure out what other services may be available, which may include shelter and housing, assistance with criminal justice advocacy through filing a police report, or liaisoning with the district attorney's office. I mentioned the legal piece. We have immigration attorneys, we have family law attorneys, and also housing attorneys that can really answer a lot of questions that may be first and foremost in a person's mind. And then we also have economic empowerment programs that are available to survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence that include financial literacy or basic literacy classes. So again, going back to our model, our goal is to provide holistic services to survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, and really the housing portion and addressing the pet and animal concerns that clients have is also a very, very important piece of this puzzle. Next slide, please. Additional resources, you can move on one more, and that I just want to provide anyone who can engage on online interactions can visit the nyc.gov /NYC Hope website for additional information and resources. This is particularly useful after hours or on the weekends when the family justice centers are closed. And so I encourage all the providers here and anyone who wants to link a survivor of domestic or gender-based violence to resources can begin by visiting a family justice center or looking at the website at NYC Hope. Next slide, please. Again, just a little bit more information on hotlines. I think this is important to have so that clients or survivors can be connected to resources. I do want to mention, I want to go back to something that Maya had mentioned about the criminal justice response to pets and animal owners or pet owners. What's interesting here in Queens in particular, and I'm hoping that this is taking flight in other boroughs and maybe even other states. Our animal cruelty division of the district attorney's office is actually co-located with the Domestic Violence Bureau of the district attorney's office, recognizing the link, the strong link between animal abuse and domestic violence is very crucial. And starting with something like that, where you're having the resources, the law enforcement and criminal justice resources connected in that way is something that Queens has done already. We have also, with our relationship with the NYPD, we have had instances where our liaison officer will coordinate with local precincts to go and accompany, in instances where it's obviously safe, accompany survivors back to their home in order to retrieve either the pet themselves or supplies that are connected with it. And we are starting to see carve outs, especially in family court orders of protection, carve outs for the ability to go ahead and retrieve beloved pets. And so some of those responses, although they may not be uniform, we are seeing those responses, and with continued awareness and with panel discussions like this, I feel that this is actually making a lot of, we're doing better than probably where we were a few years ago. I'm hoping anyway. But I just wanted to highlight some of those services that the Family Justice Center provides, and the ways that we're working with URI in particular to address the pet owners' concerns and reuniting and making sure that survivors and their pets are safe. So thank you for having me. I will turn it back over to Kevin. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Denise. The New York City Family Justice Centers do indeed provide a valuable resource to New York City communities, and we're grateful for you being here today and sharing with us all the information that you have, your work, your expertise, and all the things that you're doing in terms of safety and service to survivors. It's important. So with that said, we will now shift into the Q&A portion of this session. I encourage anyone and everyone who has questions or comments to enter those into the chat. I definitely already saw that there is one in there, but I wanted to get us started just with a question that we had listed for the day. Since there is great overlap between these populations, what are some of the ways to integrate advocacy and services for those experiencing domestic violence and homelessness, so that keeping people in both groups together with their pets is seen as important and necessary? And I posit this to any of the panelists. Please feel free to answer.
I think we're all being too polite to jump in, so I'll go and invite others to jump in as well. At the risk of oversimplifying the answer, I really think that increasing conversations is step one, and I point to this conference as an example of doing that. We've tended to sometimes have our separate conferences and training opportunities, organizations focused on each issue and less focused on the intersectionality between them. So that would be my vote as a quick and simple approach.
Yeah, I am thinking about how, making those kind of intersection or conversations. And I think there's parallels, like even just the domestic violence field or the sexual violence field. Like we often are maybe at homelessness conferences, but it's kind of like one or two workshops. But I do think, however, we can connect with the different organizations and those leading the efforts in those fields, because there's just a building out of making it more expanded. So like over the years, like there might be like one or two sessions on domestic violence and the intersection of homelessness at a homelessness conference. But like the more that we have built those partnerships and showed up, and funding always helps, and capacity to do so, that we have seen the conversation expand. So I do think, I think just, like having more content, having more conversations, having more people who are leading the way on this issue and like making it happen, I think is really helpful. So then people within the networks and wherever people are meeting virtually now. The people are just thinking about those things as they're creating programs. And I think now is a really critical time because there are a lot more resources and there's more investments in housing and programming and sheltering. So like whenever those funding streams are coming out or new projects are being created, that people are thinking about how to shelter and co-shelter in really innovative ways and ways that are really might not have been done before. So I think, yeah, I keep thinking now's the time everyone's kind of rushed, like trying to meet the needs because the housing needs are so great right now in the pandemic, but also can we like take a couple breaths and like make some programs more inclusive and work for people who want to co-shelter.
I just have to say briefly, I agree completely with Maya and Debbie said. And I think, Zoom, right? Oh, I have so many Zoom stories I can't even begin to tell you, but this is a perfect example of where we are able to have these platforms and kind of attend and get the word out, attend conferences and panel discussions or connect with different providers much easier. Normally, right, we would be siloed, especially when we're talking about, let's say, for domestic violence, or then we're housing, or we're talking about, pet ownership and things like that. Very easy to be siloed, and I think this digital age that we find ourselves makes it a lot easier to collaborate.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm actually going to take our next question from the chat. We have a question from Rosie Cross who asks, are there any thoughts on assisting someone with housing when they have an animal and a history of neglect and or animal hoarding?
That's a very real world, like difficult issue. And I think, I don't have a lot of expertise on that in terms of, I've run shelters and worked at a lot of shelters, but I think that just like the human part of like however we can support people in community and trying to figure out like ways, if someone is in a shelter, are there ways that we can support that person in trying to care for their animal. I know it's very time and staff intensive, but yeah, we're trying to figure out ways. I just think in general, like ways that we can care for one another and care for our pets and create less harm. And often while systems like it's really traumatic for animals and their owners if they're separated, even if there's it might be best for the animal in the long run, but if there's ways that we can prevent that and help support people along the way to keep their pets together. I mean, I just think about there's a lot of work I've done with women more with child welfare involvement, and there is a lot of research around that, like that it causes a lot more harm and there's a lot more negative child outcomes when you're separated from your family of origin. So however we can provide support, and so many issues I feel like that create challenges for people in their lives, or like lack of money and resources, and I feel like that's a hard sell sometimes to just give people money, but I think money really can help a lot too, like giving people support, resources, money, and trying to keep people together and keep their support animals connected. I know that's much harder if you're seeing things on the ground and things are, and you're concerned about an animal and what's happening. So there's not a simple answer. So I don't know if other people have ideas or thoughts.
Yeah, it's certainly where hoarding enters the equation. If there's any promise, it's in a multi-systemic, very interdisciplinary, cross-agency response, which is exactly the type of response we're trying to build to tackle these other wicked problems. So certainly a lot of room for growth in that area, but pointing to collaboration appears to be the way.
I believe we may have time for one more question. Let me see if I can take another question from the chat. Okay, we have this one. How, from Jessica Cabrera, how can we address singles and their pets with homeless shelters? I shared this before. I had a client who had to leave their pet behind with the person who caused her harm because the homeless shelter does not allow pets. The EV shelter does not have available space for them. What can we do to give them more shelter options?
Well, again, Again, at risk of oversimplifying, I'll simply say more of what we've been talking about today. I think more of everything that we've been talking about, right? So more interagency collaborations, more funding streams. Something I didn't mention in my talk, but I think is important, expanding the stakeholders whom we're open to working with and involving more members and agencies from the community in response to this issue. I mean, the number of times I've seen somebody like a veterinarian, for example, reach out to an agency and say, I understand the issue of animals and domestic violence, I want to help, and perhaps not be well received, or the agency not be open to that. There are some certainly understandable reasons for concerns about confidentiality and security in the field, but I think when tackling an issue that is so inherently multidisciplinary, we have to be open to a broader range of stakeholders to collaborate. So I'll add that on the pile. And I too am seeing so much great conversation in the chat, and regretful that we don't have time to address all of it.
No, absolutely, absolutely. But in the interest of wrapping up and respect to everyone's time, I do, of course, want to thank all three of you ladies for all of the well of information that you've shared with us today. It has been fantastic. And I guess I would just like to ask if there's, in short, any parting words or bit of advice that you give to the assembled attendees.
I'm just really grateful and thankful to be here. And, you know, this is, there's always a need for more funding and services and affordable housing. So just however we can work there to get there, and options for people. So it's, these aren't easily, they're complex issues, not always easily solved, but always good to be with people who are trying to help to solve them.
And I'd say to the very inspiring programs that our other speakers outlined today, let's all challenge ourselves to be thinking about the needs in this area in the next 10 years, not solely the needs that we face today, so that we're constantly innovating and iterating our programs and services and our response to this intersectional topic to stay one step ahead and one step upstream.
I'm going to third that. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate.
And I believe with that, the breakout session has ended. Everyone, please feel free to leave or exit the room at this time. I believe we'll be linked back to the main chat. So thank you, everyone, for attending this meeting.